So thank you for your time. And I know that we interviewed you last week and we talked about some historic context to talk about what's going on. And while I don't want to make you repeat everything, I do think you can never have too many facts or context. So I will start off with that. It's been a week since George Floyd was killed. Why are we here? Why are we seeing what we're seeing, and how did we get here?
I think there's several reasons we're seeing what we're seeing. One is people are fatigued and they're frustrated and they're angry about police violence against Black Americans. And, history might determine this moment as sort of watershed moment where all of the frustrations, all of the anger, all of the fear and the anxiety around police violence vis-a-vis Black people really, comes to a head, and that frustration is really spilling out onto the society. And there's also a somewhat nuanced and somewhat complicated factor at play, and that is groups taking advantage of this particular moment. Black communities vis-a-vis the police are a vulnerable community, and that vulnerability is enabling others to latch on to this moment and to use it for whatever reason they want to. So while on the one hand, there are protesters who are damaging public property, burning police vehicles, and being engaged in physical altercations with the police that are precisely about the violence that is bestowed upon Black communities vis-a-vis the police. And there's also others who are using this as an opportune moment to articulate a politics that is not necessarily connected to this moment, right? And what I want to really emphasize is the vulnerability, because Black communities are in such a vulnerable place vis-a-vis the police. Other groups are able to latch on to this moment and this vulnerability and to use it for their own means.
And I don't want to take away from the actual message and what started all of this in the first place. You're right. There's people out there who just want to burn things and cause havoc, who have nothing to do with the reason behind why this even all started. And so I want to focus on why this started and what we can do, because from the beginning, we've interviewed countless, not just protesters, but church leaders, activists, historians who say, this is good that people are being heard because they're acting, but unless we take actual action and move forward, this is just going to keep repeating and repeating and repeating. And we've seen it happen time and time again. You did an interview about it last week. So second question is, what we're seeing, is this just about George Floyd? And if not, what is it? Give me your personal aspect, or make, I guess, our viewers see that this isn't just about some awful acts in Minneapolis.
No, this isn't just about George Floyd. It's about the many George Floyds, and the fact that this has been a running reality in Black communities going back generations and generations. And that it's about fear, it's about anger, it's about frustration. And it's also about the fact that we are still in this moment. Like, we are still in this moment. This kind of anti-Black police violence goes back to the turn of the century. And the fact that we are in the 21st century still grappling with these same problems is deeply frustrating. And it illustrates that progress has not been made when Black lives can be taken away in an instant and no accountability, and without any accountability. So I think that it is not just about Mr. Floyd, but it's also about seeing those images. For decades, these have been stories that parents have told their children, that elders have told the young. They've been captured in popular culture. If we look at films like Do the Right Thing, we look at contemporary films like Queen and Slim. If we think about rap music, NWA, Tupac, the 2015 album To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar, popular culture and the narratives in Black communities have been capturing this and have been retelling this story for decades. But with the advent of smartphones and the fact that, people have movie studios in their pockets now we can see the carnage. We can see the violence. We can capture the racism in its awful articulation. And this is what is helping to set things off. Because now it's not only the stories, right, which were painful and enraging. It's not only the way in which they're being retold in popular culture, which are both powerful and sad, but now we have footage. And, going back to Rodney King, that footage didn't produce any consequences. And we can keep going forward. The footage, the video produces no consequences. So the moment this happened, many of us already knew there would be little, if any, consequences. And that really set people off.
Yet, I believe there are a lot of people out there who think this is a very rare occasion, that most cops or humans aren't racist, that it's like there's understanding that Black people have a history of oppression, but it's really hard to grasp if you're not Black because you don't live that reality. And so when you see these images, of course you're appalled and you're outraged and you're like, how could you do that? And there should be consequences, but this isn't every day. I have Black friends and they don't talk about that and they're fine. I think there's a feeling out there, this is not really an everyday issue. This isn't something that, you go home with at night every day. And that's not the case when you talk to people who are like, this happens, not to that extent. You don't have a knee on your neck for 9 minutes, but you experience some sort of injustice all the time. It's in our society. And I think that's really hard to explain.
James Baldwin, the novelist, playwright, thinker, is one of my favorite writers of all time. He once said that to be Black in America is to be in a constant rage. And I think that is apropos right now, is that the constant inequities, the ubiquitous slights, the fear and the anxiety of being Black and in public, and what that might mean vis-a-vis our safety, whether it be from some vigilante or the police. And it is walking around in the world with that level of anxiety, and also knowing the stories and the narratives that have shaped our lives in this country. It has us on edge. And so we of course we all know that what happened to Mr. Floyd and others is not an everyday occurrence. But what is the everyday occurrence is the fact that we are overly policed, that we are seen as criminal, that we are projected as the domestic boogeyman. And as a result, the society writ large, policing institutions and other public institutions, respond to us as if we are not valuable and that our lives don't mean anything. And that is the constant stress and anxiety that Black people deal with. And then you have these moments of anti-Black violence that crystallize it, that capture it, right? And this sends us into the streets, right? This reproduces the anger, and it also stirs up the trauma, that we all are collectively a part of. To know that you are part of a people who are hunted and devalued and whose lives can be taken away at any moment for any reason, and no accountability, without any accountability, that's a psychic pressure and form of trauma that Black people in this country are constantly living with, whether consciously or unconsciously. It's there. It's the stress in our bodies. And this moment brings all of that to the forefront. It brings it to the forefront of our conscious minds. It brings it to the surface of our skin. And we are faced with having to respond to it, because the nation has not responded to it, and the nation continues to not respond to it. And to also do things like raise our children at the same time, be involved in our community, have relationships, go to work. You know, it's a tremendous balancing act that we have to maintain. And it is extremely, extremely difficult, but it is that stress, that anxiety that creates that has such a profound impact on our daily lives. And these moments of violence just bring it all to the surface again.
Okay, so I think most people who watch the footage of the officer with the neck on George Floyd and see him literally die on camera are outraged. I mean, most people see that and think, no way, that guy needs to be convicted, including the 3 other officers. And, you know, they speak up, they post about it, you know, all over social media. Like, if you don't think this is outrageous, then you need to reconsider. Is that enough to voice your anger against what happened to George Floyd, or does more need to happen?
More needs to happen, much more. You know, if the collective white response of this is horrible should have happened a decade and a half ago, should have happened with Rodney King. That was the adequate response decades ago. Where we should be at now is this shouldn't be happening, first off. This shouldn't be happening. But where white Americans need to be now is they should be asking themselves 2 questions. How have I or we enabled this? And how can I and we stop this? The enabling is simple. It's the silence. It's the collective white silence that every Black child who has been killed by a police officer, every Black woman who has been mishandled and beaten on camera, every Black boy who is seen as a threat, and the way in which that narrative functions in the larger national discourse, all of those things have enabled this moment. What white people didn't say about the horror of Mike Brown's killing and the fact that his body was left in that hot street for 4 hours, their silence made George Floyd possible. What you know, middle-aged and people my age, you know, white Americans did not say about Rodney King 30 years ago enabled this moment, and all of the other moments in between. Silence means complicity. And it doesn't mean, you know, and regardless of whether, you know, you have physical or intimate relationships with people of color, regardless of what your personal politics is, you know, regardless of whether you agree with the civil rights movement and all the sort of rhetoric that white Americans use to mobilize an understanding of themselves as not being racist, the fact that there has been large-scale silence, that silence enabled this moment, because it tells both the police and white vigilantes that killing Black people, maiming us, there will be no accountability. And they can do it with impunity and continue to go on and live their lives. I mean, just as an example, that horrific killing in the church in South Carolina in, I believe it was 2016 or 2017. The police officers took that young man to McDonald's or Burger King from when they picked him up, murdering 9 people in that church on his way to the police station. He was hungry, and they thought, getting him a Whopper, something to eat, was a good gesture. He slaughtered 9 people. He devastated 9 families. He shattered the lives of thousands, and those cops thought it was necessary to get him a sandwich. It's that kind of insensitivity and unwillingness to see our lives as being valuable that is enabled by the collective silence of white Americans. And so point one is that silence, saying nothing, going along, pretending like everything is just okay, has enabled this moment. I think the second thing is, what do white Americans need to do? One thing white Americans have to do is they have to recognize that they have a central role to play in whether this happens again. White Americans' collective actions right now will determine what happens the next time this happens and whether or not we'll deal with this in a decade. One of the things white Americans definitely have to come to terms with is that the privileges that white Americans have that are oftentimes invisible to them have to be made visible, they have to be accounted for, and white Americans are going to have to give them up. If white Americans are truly interested in racial justice, if white Americans truly value the lives of Black people and other people of color, then the kind of privileges that they have to be called into question, challenged, and white Americans have to begin to distance themselves from them. And there are ways that it can be done individually and collectively. But accountability, no longer being silent, recognizing that white Americans have privileges and challenging them is how we are going to deal with this problem. And I think it will also extend to other problems of racial inequity when we talk about things like poverty, access to healthcare, mobility, being able to purchase a home, education. I think all of those things have a tremendous impact.
And they all play a huge role in why we're here in the first place. Now, okay, I'm going to back up because I do really want to, I guess, try to make this somewhat helpful for people who feel like they want to help and they don't know how. So you said the first thing was silence. And I am seeing people speak out against George Floyd's death and kind of appalled, and maybe now starting to listen to the reasons behind the protests, and that this, like you said, is an everyday battle. And so I do think people are trying to understand it. Like I said, it's really hard to understand because you don't live it, but I think there's some sympathy there. The second one is a lot harder. You said understanding the privilege. Can you expand on what it looks like to act for someone? Let's say one of our viewers is a parent at home with kids. They work, they have their own issues at home. They feel appalled about what's going on. They want to make a difference. They're not going to go out and protest, though. That's not what they do. But they want to do something. What can they do? I asked you over the phone, is this a matter of, do I start reading about history? What is it that is impacting Black communities that I didn't know about? Do I register to vote in a specific, is it a voting thing? Is it a political thing? Do I volunteer? Do I need to make more Black friends? What can I do? Because as of now, besides me saying this is outrageous, I don't really know what else I can do.
I think the most important thing, and this is a very practical thing, it could be done at home, millions of people tonight. is for white Americans to look inward and ask first, what does it mean to be white in this country? And how does that reality shape my perspective and my experience? So for example, a lot of people want to start with the question of how to address racial inequality by looking at those who suffer from it. And of course that makes sense. The better, I think, move is to look at those who do not suffer and ask how are they involved and how can they change it. So if white Americans took stock of what it meant to be white, right? The work of anti-racism is work that we all have to do across ethnic, racial lines. But white Americans have a very important role to play by asking themselves, what does it mean to be white? How does my experience as a white person shape my understanding of what is going on? How does my experience as a white person shape how I understand how policing works? And having, what we would call a critical interrogation of the self, to look at oneself. That can be done, the working parents and their children, for the parents to say, look, what we're seeing in the news is awful. And it's frustrating, it's sad, it's infuriating. And we as a white family have a role to play. And for that family to sit and have a conversation about, to ask for the father to ask, the children, or the children to ask the parents, what does it mean for us to be white? What does that mean for us? And how do we understand it, right? That act sets off a chain reaction that forces people to really look at what the racial position of whiteness means in this country and how it shapes experiences, opportunities, and how white Americans can use that vantage point, that perspective, to affect change. So if I were to start anywhere, I would say that, white Americans need to really understand themselves, and they really don't, right? White Americans take so little stock if it needs to be balance, it needs to be power. Men are concerned with gender because they're privileged, and for them, gender is meaningless. Straight people oftentimes care very little about sexuality because they're in a privileged position. Middle class and the wealthy, having a sort of class conscious understanding of their lives isn't necessary. But for the poor, for sexual minorities, for women, and for people of color, these things are extremely, extremely valuable. So I would ask for white Americans to examine themselves and to examine their relationship with the criminal justice system, and to ask, how do I understand my relationship with the police? How do I understand my relationship with them? Do I have this fear every time a cop is behind me? If not, why not? Why am I not afraid? These people over here keep talking about their fear. Okay, I don't understand that. But what I do understand is that I am not. And why am I not afraid? And these people are. Are they treating us differently? Is something happening? That conversation, I think, can do tremendous good for resolving this moment and future moments, right? Those in power, those who have positions of privilege, if they want to help, they have to look inside, right? They really have to look at themselves and understand their position. And the next step is to ask how their position has contributed to this moment. How their position has contributed to this moment. And again, I would apply this to questions of sexuality, questions of class, and to questions of gender. If men are really interested in in dealing with the issue of patriarchy, they don't need to go to women. Women have been dealing with this since time immemorial. They have strategies, they have organized themselves, they have an analysis, they understand this. Men are the problem. And if men can only say, I stand with her, then they're not doing anything. But what men have to do is they have to look inside and say, how does my position as a man enable for the Harvey Weinsteins of the world? How does my position as a man enable for the unequal pay that women are get in the world, right? And I would, again, this functions simultaneously in this exact same way in terms of race, right? How does my position as a white American and how I interact with the police, how does it shape my understanding of what's going on? And how does it contribute to the killing of people like George Floyd and others?
That in itself is a very, very difficult task, and I do think it's a good place to start. Do you think that that is enough, though, that will lead to action and change? I mean, I think in an ideal world, if we all really realized that, yes, it's up to the people that have the privilege and have the power, really, the majority. Hopefully, it would do a chain reaction of policy and actual change. Do you think that's enough? Is there anything else that we should be I don't know, maybe it's just like the people I follow, and I'm in a different generation than my parents, so I don't know what they're seeing on social media, but I'm seeing a lot of like, it's not enough to be outraged, educate yourselves, donate to this, sign up for your local chapter of maybe an activism or Black Lives Matter, something like that. Do you think that, I am definitely understanding that the first thing we need to do is look inside. I think that's very difficult and important. Is there anything else in terms of action for those who understand they do have a role to play that they can do?
Yeah, I think, supporting Black Lives Matter. I think being involved in anti-racist struggles. I think education. I think these are all absolutely essential. And they provide a kind of material, they provide the material for the transformations that we want to see. So I would absolutely say yes, white Americans, donate to your local Black Lives Matter chapter. Absolutely. Phoenix has one. They need resources. Cut a check today. I would also, at the education piece, this somewhat goes back to the last point that I made. White Americans think that race is the problem of people of color, and that white Americans don't deal with race, that somehow, being white is just universal, non-racial. White is a racial category. White people engage in the politics of race all the time, every single day, no matter what they're doing, right? This is all part of it. And I think education can help to shape the perspective of white Americans, to get them to understand that they are engaged in the politics of race and the practice of race themselves, even through doing something as normal as going on a date, buying a house, putting their kids in school. That's all part of the politics of race. And so I would, I think reading, listening, and watching are really valuable. And I have some suggestions of things that white Americans might want to read, listen to, and watch to help shape their perspectives about themselves and about these broader communities. So I have a list of first some book recommendations. I have some podcasts, and I actually have some other forms of popular culture, television and film. Two books written by the same person. His name is Ibrahim Kendi. One of the books won the National Book Award, I believe it was for 2019, and it's called Stamped: A History of Racist Ideas in America. And it's really about, how the racist ideas emerged and the impact racist ideas had. Going back from the founding of this country to the election of Barack Obama. The second book is How to Be an Anti-Racist, also written by Ibrahim Kendi. And it's about what anti-racism is, right? White Americans confuse non-racism with anti-racism. Anti-racism is an active approach to undermining the stability of racism, whether that be through voting, whether it be through political contribution, whether it be through having conversations with your children about what it means to be a person of color, what it means to be white, right? It means participating in anti-racist struggles, such as the one that we're seeing on the street right now. Many white Americans practice non-racism, and that non-racism is just silence. Just don't talk about it, and then, it'll go away. That non-racism is complicit with racism. And it's not an anti-racist approach, which in the anti-racist approach is to put race front and center, engage it, talk about it, make it part of the life that one lives, right? So we want to see conscious white Americans who are thinking about and interrogating their whiteness and really grappling with it, right? This is what feminists have been saying about men for centuries, right? We feminists want men who not just participate in feminist movements, but who are actively interrogating what it means to be a man and how that is complicit in their subjugation. The third book is a relatively recent book written by a journalist. It's called White Fragility, and it's about these conversations about whiteness and how conversations about race and this sort of fragile positions that white Americans take makes it difficult to have a conversation about race because white Americans get upset. There's tears, there's anger, there's all of these things. And what it does is it undermines the ability to have the very conversation I've been saying we need to have. So I would highly recommend White Fragility. The fourth is a book by a well-known philosopher, but it's very accessible. All the books I'm mentioning are very, very accessible. And it's called White Privilege and Black Rights. And it was written in 2017 by Naomi Zach. And it's a book about the killings, about white police officers killing Black men and women. And it is, it's prophetic. It really speaks to this moment right now. And it was written 3 years ago. I mentioned James Baldwin earlier, The Fire Next Time. I think that should be required reading for everybody in this country. It's just a beautiful book about the politics of race and how we deal with it. In the close of the book, Baldwin has a quote where he says, until white Americans and Black Americans come together like lovers and deal with the horror of race, we will continue to deal with this. And he has this quote from the Bible where he says, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. And the point is that if Black Americans, white Americans don't grapple with the reality of race, that it's going to undermine the stability of the country. And it's going to make it impossible for us to function. It's going to undermine our institutions. It's going to undermine our relationships. It is going to be the cancer, the pandemic, if you will, that's going to destabilize the country. Similar to that is a recent book written by written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes for The Atlantic or has been a writer for The Atlantic. Between the World and Me is a series of essays similar to The Fire Next Time that grapples with this. Can I give a few more? Or is that too many?
You can keep going. And I will ask you, if you can, to send me this in an email, but
okay.
You can keep naming a few. I might post this entire thing if people want to watch it all.
Yeah. The next one is last year's Pulitzer Prize winning book, 2 years ago, Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Underground Railroad, written by Colson Whitehead. Colson was just recently in the news because he won the Pulitzer again, the first time someone has won the Pulitzer again. But the book Underground Railroad is about a real railroad that is moving slaves from the South to the North. But it's really about the cancer of racism and how all parts of the country were involved in the politics of race and racism, and even the sort of North that was free and the South which was not. They were both equally involved in the politics of slavery and the slave trade. The next is a book I'm pretty sure you know, and it's considered now an American classic on the same level as
Hold on, Rashad, you froze. You can hear me, you are frozen. So hold on a second.
Love. It is marriagely haunted original and the third. All right.
Oh man, I lost you for like a minute there. I was like, no.
That's all right. That's all right. I was talking about I have two podcasts that I think are quite useful. One is NPR's Code Switch, which is a podcast on race in America, race and ethnicity. I think it's absolutely fantastic. The most recent 1619 podcast by the New York Times, which is about slavery. It is absolutely amazing. And then I have 4 pieces of popular culture that I think the listeners would really enjoy. The first is a recent film titled Queen and Slim. It's about a Black couple who go on a date. The date ends with a police officer being shot, and they go on the run. It's sort of kind of a Bonnie and Clyde film, but it's really about this moment, about police profiling and the ubiquity of the haunting of police vis-a-vis Black people and Black communities. The next 2 are done by the same director, Anna DuVernay, and that's 13th, which is on Netflix. She won an Academy Award for it. I believe it was 2016 or 2017. And then she also won an Emmy for the series When They See Us, which is about the Central Park Five, the 5 Latino and Black boys who were accused of raping a white woman in 1989. One spent 13 years in prison. They were all exonerated. It's a powerful, deeply disturbing portrayal, but I think one that we all need to engage. And the last one is an HBO series titled The Watchmen, which was built on a comic book series that was really popular a couple of decades ago. And it centers around the 1921 Tulsa race riots. Yesterday was the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa race riots. It centers on the Tulsa race riots and how that moment shaped that city, Tulsa, and its impact. You know, I think all of these books, these podcasts, these forms of popular culture, they're a way for white Americans in particular to start to have a conversation amongst themselves about the politics of race. Black people cannot change this by themselves. We're only 12% of the population. We do not have and exercise the kind of power that white Americans do. We don't control the institutions. And in order for us to continue to live in this country, we need white Americans to do their part. And our lives and the quality and the quantity of our lives depend on it. And that's part of the reason why people are in the streets, because we have been asking, we have been begging, and no one listened. You know, there's this wonderful quote by Tupac Shakur, the late Tupac Shakur. I really encourage your listeners to check this quote out, and I think it might help them to think about this moment. Tupac says, you know, if I see people eating in a room and I'm starving, and I can see them, you know, he says, throwing salami around. He says, I can knock on the door and I can try to sing my way in. You know, I am hungry, please let me get some food. He said, after a couple of months, that song is gonna get more intense. And he said, and there won't be any knocking. He said, they're gonna start banging on the door. And he said, you know, after decades, he said, there's no more knocking on the door. He says, I'm picking the lock and I'm coming through. And I think that we're at that moment where people have sung their way, have tried to sing their way into, you know, the American consciousness, had tried to appeal to white America's better sense, and we were ignored. And now there's no more singing, there's no more asking. We want justice. And if it means we have to burn down police cars, police stations, then so be it. You know, we are collectively fatigued and tired. And, you know, we need help. And we have helped ourselves for centuries. And we are in this moment where we need white Americans to stand and be accountable. And I fear that white Americans will do what they have been doing, which is to either be silent, to be non-racist, or just to wait until it's over. And all that's doing is prolonging the inevitable. But when this happens again, it will be much more intense and it'll be worse for everybody.
You've studied major events in the past similar to this, where there were riots and there were, you know, this is different, like you said, because it was caught on camera. But how do you feel watching what's unfolding right now, speaking to community members? Does this feel different at all? Or are you, I know you said you're scared that nothing's going to change, but do you have a sense of, okay, this time is different? Or is this just like, we've seen this time and time again, let's see if anything changes?
I'm of two minds. You know, part of me wants this to be that watershed moment that's going to change things from here on out. Because I am an optimist, part of me believes that. The other side of me is a bit more pessimistic. And you know, because, and that pessimism is enabled by what I'm seeing in the news. So I had to get off social media a while ago, so I'm just not on social media. But you know, what I'm seeing in the news and what I'm hearing from white Americans is that there's an obsession over the rioting and the looting, and it's like, you know, and this is the slippery slope, right? Like now it's like George Floyd and his murder is now taking a backseat to, you know, a Gap getting burned down. So I'm of two minds of it. You know, part of me wants to be optimistic, and the other part of me is not as hopeful.
All right, last time, I'm going to ask the question so quickly, it cannot be frozen. What is the takeaway message the one thing people have to remember or that you want them to know after all of this?
I want them to know that racism is not inevitable. It is not a natural fact of life, and that it can be changed. And the only way that it can be changed is through sacrifice and through engagement. And particularly for white Americans, they have the biggest role to play in whether this continues or not. If they remain silent, if they put their hands up and say, I don't know what to do, if they say, well, this doesn't affect me, this will continue to happen. And that white Americans' action, their participation in this moment is essential. This is not a Black problem. It is an American problem. And white Americans have an absolute essential role to play. And I particularly want middle-aged, middle-class, suburban white Americans and people in this state to hear this message and to know that whether they live in a community that is multiracial or all white, that this is their problem. Whether their partners are people of color or not, this is their problem. Whether they were active in Obama's campaign or they voted for Trump, this is their problem. And their actions now, what they do or don't do now, will determine what happens in the future.
Thank you very much for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to say? I just said thank you for your time, and if there's anything else you'd like to say.
Oh boy, what? Yes. I'm a parent, and I think if there's a message I can give to, a sort of subgroup parents, white parents, your children are watching. They're watching. And what you do will plant the seed for what they do or don't do in the future. So just know that if white parents are silent, their children, they're teaching their children that silence in the face of this is okay. If white parents are active, they're teaching their children that responding to this kind of crisis by being engaged and present is how to resolve it. So, I think particularly for that group, because a lot of times, parents like to say, I'm too busy to do this or I'm too busy to do that. I understand that, right? I'm a parent too. But I think white parents in particular, you need to know that your children are watching and you are sending a message about who you are and where you stand and how you deal with situations such as this. And I think it's important that white parents hear that message, that their children are paying attention, and it will make a difference as to whether or not this kind of these actions continue to happen or not.